Greetings. Let me begin by stating that when I say source, I'm referring to the ultimate force in the universe. If you are referring to that same force when you say or call on God, Jehovah, Allah, or by whatever name you use, then we are speaking of the same ultimate creative energy. Before I get to the subject of this talk, I'm happy to say that we voted Trump out of office, thereby giving ourselves the opportunity for rebirth, the opportunity to recreate ourselves and to co-create a new world according to the will of Source. However, in choosing the path of rebirth over the path of destruction, the American people chose a candidate more inclined to return us to a pre-Trump America. That was a mistake. This decision places us in a position in which we are not able to take full advantage of the opportunity that Source prepared for us by way of Donald Trump. We should have chosen a more progressive candidate whose policies would have put us in a better position to perform the work we'll soon be required to do. By listening to managers of the old order and electing Joe Biden, we've made our way unnecessarily more difficult. Consequently, we'll just have to put in the extra work necessary to secure our needs, even as we begin preparation for our role in constructing Source's kingdom and leading humanity. Here, let me remind you that we are in the fourth stage of the seven-stage divine intervention that began in 1992. The fourth stage is a stage of transition. It is the crisis point in the seven-stage universal process of constructing a new planet, birthing a new people, and creating a new world. This stage continues through 2021. At 2022, as I stated in my first video, we entered the fifth stage, the stage of regeneration or rebirth. At that point, we begin the process of recreating ourselves. So hang tough and let us do what's necessary to see ourselves through the remaining months of this crisis. As with Trump, the human embodiment of the fourth stage disintegrative energies, it is in our hands to end the COVID-19 pandemic, a complementary manifestation of those very same energies. As I explained in my video, the COVID-19 pandemic is in divine order. The pandemic was necessary to increase the intensity of the fourth stage disintegrative force already operating through Donald Trump. Together, Trump and the pandemic composed the second surge in the vibratory rate that I prophesied over 22 years ago. Note that spikes in COVID-19 are described by that very same term, surge. This second surge we witness as the pandemic itself, as the growing numbers of infections and numbers of deaths, and as new strains and variations of the disease. We witness it as the loss of employment for millions, the closing of businesses, and the resulting inability to pay mortgages, rents, or to secure housing, even as evictions and foreclosures. We witness this disintegrative process as the climb in the number of people not knowing where their next meal is coming from, the climb in the number of people without enough food to eat, and the climb in the number of people relying on food giveaways. We admit the existence of a process tearing apart our social order by our state's attempts to maintain order through exempting from stay-at-home orders those workers employed in industries providing food, water, security, caretaking, healthcare, pest management, and certain other services, even as low-wage workers risk high exposure to the virus. We witness the disintegrative process as the overburdening of our healthcare systems. We see it in our overstressed healthcare workers, in their psychological trauma and physical and emotional exhaustion. We see it as the continued disruption of many of our education systems. We see it in the surrealness of a masked existence and the necessity of social distancing. We see it as limited social contact and interactions due to measures instituted to decrease and even halt infection. We witness the disintegration process in the varied reactions against those measures, including armed threats in state capitals. We witness the disintegration process in our desperate attempts to mentally and emotionally endure this crisis, seeking remedies that unfortunately, find some of us taking our own lives. The intensification of the disintegrative energies tearing apart our society produced the highest voter turnout since 1900. Americans demonstrated an impassioned intent to either rid the country of then President Donald Trump on the one hand, or to retain his services on the other. As a result of this severe, exceptional polarization brought on by this most unique character, Americans generated the two highest vote counts in United States history. Joe Biden became the first presidential candidate to surpass 80 million votes. Though in a losing cause, then President Trump's total of over 74 million votes became the second highest in U.S. history. We witnessed the fourth stage disintegrative energies in Trump's final act of tearing apart America. True to his function in Source's plan, then President Trump incited what would become a failed, armed, white supremacist insurrection. It was Trump's last stand. Though failing the coup, it wasn't a complete failure. Where Trump succeeded is in the shattering of any illusion of American solidarity and invulnerability. The visual of his army of white domestic terrorists storming the Capitol, some with the intent to capture and kill, aided in their entry by a few Capitol Police and the presence of an undermanned, ill-prepared, and ill-equipped Capitol Police force, the result of an obviously white-biased, untenable leadership decision made by leaders more than likely complicit, may have emboldened other nations or entities to further test the exposed vulnerabilities of a country divided. Trump's insurrection, in service to the universal law, may have done more damage than is apparent. All in all, disintegration of our present world has been necessary in order to make way for a new world. This brings me directly to the purpose of this talk. We have reached the transition point, which I'll describe shortly. At this point, on the eve of our rebirth, you must decide whether to recognize and acknowledge the presence of Source or not. You must decide whether to align yourself with its will and purpose for us or not. You must decide whether to have faith in Source or to have faith in white people's willingness and ability to transform themselves into just beings and to do right by us. The one choice leads to our liberation and ascension. The other to our continued oppression, albeit by a different oppressor. Understand that Source is here, and its presence and its law are not dependent upon whether or not you believe in it. As I've demonstrated through my talks, its will is being carried out. The choice you have is whether to work with it or against it. Let me explain. The primary goal of disintegrating or tearing apart the systems, structures, and institutions that compose nations and ultimately our world is to expose or discharge the founding principle or animating spirit upon which a nation or world is created. This is the function of the two crisis points of the fourth stage. The first gave us the presidency of Donald Trump, the human embodiment of the fourth stage disintegrative energies, in 2016. And the second crisis point, or surge of the vibratory rate, added to Trump the COVID-19 pandemic, a complementary manifestation of the very same fourth stage disintegrative energies at the end of 2019. By discharging the founding principle of a nation, what remains of the disintegrated nation is rendered in need of and made susceptible to a new organizing principle. This new founding principle over time gradually reorients the people and reorders what remains of the former nation into a new civilization. When the founding principle of a nation is discharged, know that we have reached the transition point in Source's seven-stage process, and that a new people and a new world are soon to be birthed. As I earlier declared, we have reached that point of transition. Now I'll present to you the evidence. Let us consider the law of transition in the concise form I gave to you in my December 14, 2019 video, The Divine Intervention of 1992, Part 2, What Specifically is Source Creating and How Do We Figure into Its Process? There I state, the law of transition, the 7-stage process we are presently undergoing, demands that in order for a new world to be birthed, the existing core principle or animating spirit of the present world must be discharged. In order to demonstrate that we have reached the point of transition, I must find a point in time at which the core principle of America was discharged. And I must show that this discharging was caused by one or both of the expressions of the 4th stage disintegrative energies. Recall that I've stated throughout my presentations dating back to the Divine Intervention Part 1 in September 2019 that the founding principle of the United States is white superiority, black inferiority. In one instance, the European white master, African black enslaved relationship. Now think back to the early stages of the COVID-19 outbreak in the United States. At that time, evidence began to mount that the virus disproportionately affected black people, causing higher rates of infection and death in comparison to whites. And holding with the founding principle of white superiority, black inferiority, the conventional explanation for these disparities, as widely broadcast through the media, was that African Americans' personal behaviors, cultural practices, and innate biological differences were the cause of our higher rates of infection and death. However, this conventional, unsubstantiated narrative of black inferiority was challenged and overcome by the witness of physicians, epidemiologists, public health professionals, lawyers and other civil rights advocates, scholars, research institutes, and journalists through various media, bringing to bear the decades of research and evidence proving that the disparity between blacks and whites, whether it be in health, healthcare, education, income, or wealth, is due to structural or systemic racism. Most significantly, in unconscious conformity to the law of transition, this barrage of accounts and declarations identifying and bringing to light systemic racism credits the pandemic itself with exposing this rot at the root and coursing through the veins of the American social order. Here are a few examples of those statements. The COVID-19 crisis has put the lethal legacy of slavery on full display. The still present legacy of slavery in America, systemic racism. COVID-19 starkly reveals how structural injustice cut short the lives of people subjected to systemic racism and economic deprivation. The coronavirus outbreak is exposing this deep-rooted structural racism in healthcare. As COVID-19 continues to move through Minnesota and the country, it exposes the pervasive and persistent nature of structural racism. COVID-19 has revealed structural racism in our policies and systems that must be eliminated. COVID-19 is the disease that has revealed our social illnesses of anti-black racism, precarious employment, sharp racial gaps in wealth and digital access, unaffordable housing, growing homelessness, unresponsive government, and so much more. Structural racism has long set the fortunes and limited the potential of communities of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people. Disparities in COVID-19 infections and deaths are laying bare the underlying structural racism that protesters are seeking to disrupt. These findings confirm that an expression of the 4th stage disintegrative energies, COVID-19, whose function is to break and tear apart the social fabric of the world, has through its function exposed or revealed the underlying operating system of the United States, structural racism, the lethal legacy of slavery. I say the operating system because, again, the ultimate function of the 4th stage energies, now this is a universal law, its ultimate function is to discharge the core principle of the outgoing order. That's what it does, and that's what it did. To remove any doubt that these declarations meet the criterion of discharging what they have identified as the core principle of the United States, let us consider what it means to discharge. One meaning of discharge is to release from confinement. This definition is met by the declarations that COVID-19 put on full display, revealed, exposed, laid bare structural racism. Discharge is also defined as to give outlet or vent to, emit. Emit in turn is defined as to issue with authority, especially to put something such as money into circulation, and to give utterance or voice to. These definitions are met by authorities publicly declaring through a variety of media that structural racism, a legacy of enslavement, is the cause of the disparities between blacks and whites. Finally, discharge means to release or remove that by which one is burdened or confined. Here we again equate release with to put on full display, reveal, expose, to lay bare that which has been identified as burdening, confining, and otherwise oppressing black folk, the indigenous, and other people of color, structural racism. America's self-humanity has been limited to a fraction of its true potential due to groups of its people being burdened with structural racism. Regarding the removal of this burden, I'll cover that shortly. So far, we seem to have met the criteria for a new world to be birthed. An expression of the fourth stage disintegrative energies has been credited by authorities with discharging the core principle of the United States. However, the seventh stage universal law demands precision and absolute clarity. As the ever-growing chorus of authorities began to acknowledge and assert the origin of racial disparities in the social order, so to make unequivocally clear the anti-blackness at the root of structural racism, and to ensure that America's core principle, white superior, black inferior, be displayed, acknowledged, and understood worldwide, a video of a vivid physical demonstration of the founding principle went viral, reminding the world of the frequent and commonplace dehumanization of black life by the systems, structures, institutions, and agents of America. On May 25th, the life was deliberately and defiantly choked out of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, aided by 3 accomplices, even as Floyd pleaded for mercy, desperately stated more than 20 times he couldn't breathe, and called out to his mother. This image of a white officer with his knee on the neck of his black murder victim vividly demonstrated the core principle upon which the United States is founded: the white superior, black inferior hierarchy. As the video went viral, so did the outrage. Many white folk and others who had refused to believe or care about black folks' testimony of anti-black sentiment in and unjust treatment by police departments throughout the nation were horrified and incensed by the barbaric display. Many began to move, joining black folk and others protesting the murder of George Floyd, anti-black policing in general, and structural racism, sparking what may be the largest protest in American history. Moreover, the video of Floyd's murder ignited international protest in solidarity with the U.S. movements. As those in denial were forced to awaken to the severity of, ubiquitous nature of, and even the centrality of anti-blackness and its structural racism to the American social order, in addition to joining protest, they were moved to other forms of acknowledgement. Examples of some of these reactions include the escalation in the worldwide removal of statues, monuments, and memorials dedicated to slave traders, colonizers, slaveholders, Confederates, and white supremacists of all stripes, including the removal of their names from buildings and institutions, petitions to remove the names of Confederate officers from military bases. In sports, there was a swell in the number of teams and individual athletes protesting, and they protested in many forms. Sports organizations, too, were finally moved to acknowledge anti-blackness and structural racism, demonstrating their support for Black lives with BLM signage across stadiums and on LCD displays. There was also the issuing of statements such as the one by the NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, which reads in part, "We, the National Football League, condemn racism and the systematic oppression of Black people. We, the National Football League, admit we were wrong for not listening to NFL players earlier and encourage all to speak out and peacefully protest." Then we have the declaration stating that racism is a public health crisis. We have these declarations at the organizational level, at the state, county, and city levels, and at the national level. As an example of such a statement at the organizational level, in June 2020, the American Medical Association declared that racism in its systemic, structural, institutional, and interpersonal forms is an urgent threat to public health. It also denounced police brutality and stated that it will actively work to dismantle racist and discriminatory policies and practices across all healthcare. It followed up with other policy statements in November. At the state, county, and city levels, as of February the 10th, 2021, the American Public Health Association records that 5 states and 72 counties and 99 cities across 29 states have declared racism a public health crisis or emergency. The vast majority of these declarations occurred after the police murder of George Floyd. At the national level, in September 2020, Representative Ayanna Pressley, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Representative Barbara Lee introduced into the House and Senate their bill titled the Anti-Racism in Public Health Act of 2020. The bill will create a National Center for Anti-Racism to declare racism a public health crisis and to develop the research base and knowledge in the science and practice of anti-racism. The bill will also establish a law enforcement violence prevention program, taking a public health approach to combating police brutality and violence. The bill was reintroduced into Congress February the 1st, 2021. Finally, from the Office of the President. On his first day in office, January 20, 2021, President Joseph Biden issued Executive Order 13985, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. In the order, the President acknowledges the structural racism in our laws and policies and the institutional racism in our public and private institutions. Under the guidance of the Domestic Policy Council, all federal agencies will assess selected programs and policies to determine whether there exist systemic barriers that prevent people of color and the underserved from accessing and taking full advantage of the opportunities, resources, and benefits offered through their programs. And within 1 year of this executive order, they will produce a plan to remove any barriers found. Such responses and reactions testify to the immense power generated by the discharging of America's life force, its white superior, black inferior animating spirit. Together, the exposing and acknowledgement of structural racism as the cause of America's racial disparities and the image of a white agent of the state kneeling on the neck of a black man, choking the life out of him as he begs for mercy, a living illustration of America's founding principle, the root of its structural racism, along with the worldwide reactions to the event, marked the turning point in the 7-stage universal law, the point of transition. America, however, labeled its reignited consciousness and reaction America's racial reckoning. A few even termed it the Third Reconstruction. Both descriptions signifying the possibility of a profound transformation, a turning point, the possibility of recreating America into a truly just society. And yet both descriptions revealed an obstructed view of reality. They imply that America is in control of its destiny, indicating a limited knowledge and understanding of the very moment America and the world is reacting to. You see, both descriptions define America's acknowledgement of its founding principle, the white superior, black inferior hierarchy, and any attempt to remedy this crime against the universe and humanity within the context of the American experience. And in doing so, they instruct us that any possible outcomes ultimately will be determined as they have been determined. At the leisure of, in the interest of, for the comfort of, and by the will of whites in positions of power. Consequently, it is inferred that our hope remains in continuing our centuries-long quest to convince white folk and others to be just and to do right by us. Thankfully, these descriptions are founded upon unlimited knowledge and understanding of the moment. Their usage speaks of a profound and deadly disconnect, the lack of ability to see beyond the material world into the causal plane of the spiritual world. To adopt either point of view is deadly because they keep you locked into the very feedback loop that fuels white power and dominion, rendering you at odds with the universe. My teachings have been attempts to help you bridge this divide between the physical and the spiritual worlds in order that over time you can come to see, know, and understand the actual circumstance under which we presently exist. Source has returned, is present, and is compelling the planet and its inhabitants to conform to its seven-stage law of creation. What is clear is that America and its world order are unconsciously reacting to the impulses of the law, and being long out of tune with and disconnected from the divine, they attribute critical events to the only God they know, themselves. If you were closer to Source and it allowed you into its graces, you would consider and frame your understanding of the world within the context of its seven-stage law. Doing so, rather than depicting this critical milestone within the context of the American experience as America's racial reckoning or the Third Reconstruction, you would know and understand that the essence of this event is not the transformation of white folk into just beings or America into a just society. That ship has sailed, but that the exposing and acknowledgement of America's founding principle mark the actual turning point in the seven-stage process, the transition point after which I name the entire fourth stage. Moreover, you would know that having arrived at this critical juncture signals that a new founding principle is soon to take over and reorganize the social order, and perhaps most disturbing to your psyche and disruptive to your worldview, you would know and come to understand that the process of Reconstruction began in 1992. And the reckoning to which you refer is the very reason for Source's intervention. America, and by extension the world, has had many opportunities to correct its course and establish a just and humane society. Yet at every turn it has refused to do so. There have been warnings, but those warnings have not been heeded. By its words and actions, America has proven itself corrupt and irredeemable. Consequently, in 1992, Source intervened with its judgment against America, the world, and what is called Western civilization. What we are experiencing is not an American reckoning or the Third Reconstruction. It is divine judgment and its dispensing of divine justice in 7 stages. I now close. We are at the end of the 4th stage. We've reached the transition point, the very center of the 7-stage process of creation. America's founding principle, the white superior, black inferior hierarchy, has been discharged, that is, exposed and acknowledged. We have eliminated one manifestation of the 4th stage disintegrative energies. We must now halt or control the other. In 2022, we will enter the 5th stage, the stage of regeneration, the stage of rebirth. Source's new law will begin the process of recreating a new world out of what remains of our present world, torn apart by the 4th stage disintegration process. As part of the regeneration process, humanity's 2nd stage seed idea, this is our first black president, will materialize as black folk beginning their process of reorientation to Source's will in order to meet the criteria for attaining the position Source has chosen us to fulfill. Co-creators, leaders, and managers of its new civilization. Note that this process of rebirth is a process. It will take the remaining 3 stages to complete. Recall that earlier I said I would return to the final definition of discharge, to release or remove that by which one is burdened or confined. In part, the process of rebirth will consist of the removal of what remains of the self-hate, feelings of inferiority, and of white superiority. The removal of all that is untruthful, debilitating, and elsewise anti-Black, anti-historical, anti-science, and anti-source that has been and is being taught us by way of Western civilization and its white superior, Black inferior hierarchy through its channels of socialization and communication. Much of this messaging is operating subconsciously at the deepest levels of our individual and collective psyche, and has been and is being passed on from generation to generation. As the law of transition states, this spirit of white superior, Black inferior must be removed in order for a new consciousness founded in the will of Source to incarnate and gradually transform you into new beings ready to assume our function as Source's new on Source's new planet in Source's new world. And I'll speak further on that at the appropriate time. I'll return in a few months with part 3, the final part of my divine intervention series, laying out the evidence of the presence of Source and the operation of its law. Until then, be wise, be careful, be blessed, find joy, and thank Source. Peace.